So now I'm going to show you how to create a soft cap. And I've created two patterns. One was the beret pattern. So we have the top of the beret and the bottom of the beret. And then we also have the beret side band. And then I created the 8-piece cap. And I'm going to use this pattern and this beret side band pattern to create that cap. So I'm going to show you how to cut out and sew both of those. Okay, so I'm going to start with the 8-piece cap, and I originally cut out or created this pattern with the 1/2-inch seam allowance, but I don't have any tracing paper. So what I normally would do is lay the pattern down and put tracing paper, and then I would trace where the stitching line is, and then I would cut it out on the outside edge so that tracing paper can mark my fabric wherever I draw. But I don't have that, so I cut out the pattern piece and removed the seam allowance. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these 8 times because it's an 8-piece cap, but I'm going to lay it out on my fabric, and the fabric I'm using is a wool, and it's kind of like a felted wool, so it's dense and it's a little fluffy, I would say, and that makes it hard to mark, especially with chalk or pencils. So I do have my chalk, and I'm gonna try to make as thin of a mark as I can. And I'm gonna know, because I will be the one sewing it, that this mark is thicker than the actual pattern piece. You can see as I'm tracing it, like this line is definitely beyond the size of the paper. So when I sew, I know I want to stitch on the inside edge of that line, and then it'll keep my fabric the same as my pattern piece. And I created these 2 notches on either side of my pattern, which you can't see, it's a little bright, but you can see there's a line here. And that's so that I can match each pattern piece up with the other one. Okay, so that's how I traced out my pattern, and I'm going to do that, like I said, 8 times. But the next step for that would be to cut it out. And you want to mark or measure your seam allowance, which is going to be 1/2 inch. I'm pretty good at just guesstimating the 1/2 inch, but what you can do is just briefly go around and mark in a few spots so you have at least a guideline. And if you had tracing paper and you marked the stitching line, then all you would have to do is cut out the outside edge where the paper is, because that would already have your seam allowance. So that's one pattern piece. And then the other piece that I'm going to cut out for this is the side band that I mentioned. That was part of the beret. So, you know, it's hard to get this all on camera, but it is measured for a 22-inch head, or 21.5 plus a 1/2 inch for ease. So I'm going to find the long piece of the fabric. I'm going to lay it out, trace it, make sure I mark all of my side seams, center front, center back, so that I can evenly match up this pattern piece with the rest of the cap. And what I could do is cut off that seam allowance and then add that a 1/2 inch again if I'd like, or I could cut it out at this point and then mark the seam allowance, mark the stitching line. So this is the other way you can do it. So the 8-piece section, I just showed you how you would cut it without the seam allowance. And now this piece you would cut at the paper. So you could do it either way. I'm just showing you both ways right now. So I'll cut it at the paper, which includes that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then as I take this off, I'm gonna make sure I mark my side seam, right? And I can do that. Center front. And the other side seam. And then what I'm going to do is go around with my ruler, and I'm adding a 1/2 inch marking so that I know where to stitch. Okay, so that's for the 8-piece beret, and then I'll cut out the other 7 pieces of this wedge. Okay, so now I'm going to cut out the beret, and something I didn't mention with the other pattern is that you want to cut this pattern piece on the straight of grain. So we have, this is the straight of grain and this is the straight of grain. There's a warp, a warp and a weft. Okay, so and the warp and the weft is just the perpendicular lines of the weave of the fabric. And the side band, the hat band, will go with the straight of the grain. That's why it's going this way. Okay, and then with these wedge pattern pieces, they could either go this way or this way to cut them out, as long as they are following the grain. You don't want to put them on sideways or all different. You want them to always have the straight of grain going through the middle of the pattern. Now with these berets, I've drawn onto them a bias line. Okay, so usually berets are going to be placed on the bias for the center front of them. It has a better drape to it rather than following the grain for the front. It's just the way the hat sits on the head and how the fabric drapes. So with this angled arrow, I want to put the arrow on the straight of grain, and then the hat will be cut out on the bias. And I know it's a circle, so it's kind of hard to understand. If it was a different shape, it would probably make more sense, but I'm still going to put it on the bias. And so now my arrows should be following the straight of grain. And my pattern piece says center front and center back, but this line is going at a 45-degree angle on the pattern. So then this angle goes on the straight of grain, and then the center front and the center back now are at 45 degrees to the grain. Okay, so now that that's kind of cleared up a little, I'm going to pin the pieces to the fabric, and I'm just going to cut out one for each of these patterns. And I like this wool type of fabric for berets because I don't know, it's just nice and soft, and it has a thick material without it being stiff. So it works nicely for a soft cap. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is cut out each of the edges, mark center front, center back, and side with my chalk, and then I'm going to mark the seam allowance afterwards. And then for the side band, headband, I'm going to do the same thing as I did for the last hat. Okay, so once you have everything cut out, we're gonna start with the 8-piece cap, and you wanna match up each of these wedge pieces. And I have this one line that I'm gonna use to match up my pieces. So we're gonna put the right sides touching, and the right sides are the side without the marking, and the inside is the side with my marking. So this is my stitching line. This yellow line will now be the line that I followed to stitch on. And what I'm gonna do is start from this side and sew this way. And as I'm pinning, I'm putting the needle through the fabric, and I'm checking to make sure that the mark on the other side lines up. And the most important part to make sure you're getting stitched correctly is the part at the bottom of this wedge, because with all the pieces together, that equals your head size, and you don't want to change that. You want to make sure it stays as consistent as possible. So I'm going to start by pinning around this way, checking on the other side to make sure the lines line up. Okay, and then once I get to the point, I'm going to check and see if the points match. So I'm going to go and put my pin through the fabric, and I can check and see if they line up, and they don't. So I'm just going to adjust it a little bit so they do. And then what I'm going to do is stitch this way and then pivot and then go this way. So I need my pins to pivot. Oh, and I forgot, I'm actually doing it wrong. So I'm not closing this, I want to add another piece. So we're going to stitch it. We're actually going to stitch from here and off the end of the fabric. And then I'll add the next piece and pin that on and stitch it the same way. So the pins are going to go in the same direction each time. So you can pin this together all at once or do it wedge by wedge, whatever is the easiest. Okay, so now I'm gonna just start by sewing the pieces together so that you get a sense of how to do that. So I want to make sure my machine is set to a straight stitch and it has a good length. And on this machine, a good length would be 3. Sometimes on other machines, it's more of a standard size, like 2.5 is actually a good stitching length. So I'm going to start at the very bottom of the fabric. Make sure I do a reverse stitch. And then I'm going to follow the line to the end. And what I had to do was unpin the tip so that this one didn't get in the way as I was stitching. Okay, so then now I can pin it back and do the next piece. And I want this one, the line of this one, it's hard to see now, it's rubbing off, but I want this line and the point to finish here so that I'm not stitching over. Now I won't be stitching all the way straight, otherwise I will mess up this seam allowance. So I need to stop once this line gets to that stitching point, which is right there. Okay, so you can start to see it coming together. I'm just gonna work around the hat this way, just adding each piece. Okay, so I've got most of it stitched together. I'm on the very last one, and it gets really tricky up at the top where all the points come together. So do your best to make it always stitched to the same spot, but I'll show you, I'll flip it right side out and show you what it'll be like. There's probably gonna be a hole in the top, which you can finish by hand, and that's a lot of the reasons why people put buttons on the top of little caps, because you need to hide where all these points come together. At least that's what I do. Okay, so when I flip it right side out, you've got your wedges, and I'll press them so that they have a nice shape. But then look at the top, it's got kind of this funny spiral shape, and there's a hole. Okay, so I'm gonna hand stitch that closed and trim away any of the excess material. Okay, so when you start to press the inside of this hat, what you want to do is open up your seam allowance so they're kind of, I can't show you any of this. So you want to open up your seam allowance like so and press it. And it gets hard inside the hat, but try your best, just work your way around. You can use a little steam, and then it gives it a much better pressed edge, whereas like here's the unpressed, here's the pressed. So I pressed my hat, and then I needed to mark the center front, center back, and two sides for this little 8-piece cap. And so I just marked the center of one piece and went exactly opposite of that and marked the center and then the sides on each side so that it matches up to my side band. So I have that side band. What I'm gonna do is fold it, take the long ways and fold the two ends together so that they're matching, right? So this is the center back line and we're gonna stitch it together. I'm gonna do that on the machine. And then once that's stitched together, I have a circle and that should fit around my head. And I wanna press this open so that the outside seam lays flat. And then what I'm gonna do is take one of the notches and I'm gonna match up the center back with one notch. Okay, and then I have my side seam and I'm gonna match that up with this side seam notch. And then the center front. And so what this is called is quartering. So I'm dividing the hat evenly in a circle evenly, and I'm pinning them and matching them up first. I'm not starting on one end and starting here and just going around. Otherwise you'll end up with too much excess. It'll just stretch and it won't fit. It seems like it would, but for some reason when you start and go around, there ends up being a lot at the end. So instead I quarter it into 4 parts, and then I'm gonna take these parts and do the same thing. I'm gonna divide it, make sure they feel even, that there's the same amount of fabric between the pins. I'm gonna pin these inside seam allowances open so that when I stitch across them, they lay flat. So I'm gonna do that with all the seam allowances. Okay, so that's all the way pinned. And I'm gonna start at the center back and stitch here and go all the way around in a circle. And I'm gonna make sure I stitch at my 1/2 inch line. Okay, so then once that's stitched, okay, it's getting closer. It's getting closer to a hat. This is gonna get folded at the 1/2 inch other seam allowance on the other side. And then it's gonna get folded in half of that and then stitched on the inside. Okay, so then you have about a 1 inch headband that goes around. So what I'm gonna do is press this seam allowance up. I'm gonna press this one down, and then I'm gonna fold this one over that stitching line and pin it on and then hand stitch it together. Okay, so I pressed my headband, side band, so it's folded in half and it has the seam allowance folded in. And I'm gonna do a couple things now with hand sewing. So I'm gonna close up this hole at the top of the hat. And I just want it to look as nice as possible. I know it's not perfect. But I'm gonna get it close. And then I'm just gonna take my needle and thread. I have black right here, so it's gonna be hard to see. But I'm gonna just kind of close this hole up by going back and forth. And I'm pinching it on the inside with my hand. Okay, and then once that feels pretty closed, I can go on the inside and tie the knot. So I'm putting my needle towards the inside. And I'm gonna figure out where that comes out. And I haven't cleaned up any of this yet, so I will do that now. Okay. So with this inside point area, I have a bunch of threads, so I want to trim those off. And you could stitch these closed so they lay nicer, or you could trim them a little bit. And then the next thing I'm going to do, I have a button, and I'm just going to take a little bit of scrap fabric, and I'm going to cover this button with the wool. I'm just going to kind of pinch it together. And start stitching across. Okay, and then once I get that kind of together, I can wrap my thread in a circle a couple times to pull that even more, and then I can stitch across those. And I'm going to trim off all this extra fabric. Okay, so then I have my little button, and I'm going to stitch it onto the top of the cap to hide those points. So I'm going to anchor my knot first, so I'm just going to go through the fabric with my needle and make sure the knot doesn't pull through. And you don't want to pull too hard. And then I can do that one more time, and that'll help, that'll help to secure the knot. Okay, and once that's secure, I can take the button and I'm just gonna stitch it on. And to hide my knot, I can go back inside the hat. And just secure my knot on the fabric on the inside. Okay, so the next step after that is finished. I'm gonna finish this edge, and let's flip it inside out. That way it's easier to work with. And I'm gonna take this folded edge and fold it over the machine stitching line. And I'm gonna pin this edge right there. Okay, so then to stitch this, I'm just going to show you briefly with some orange thread so that you can see it. So I guess I could start in the center back. Here's my seam. And what I want to do is just grab the edge of this fold and a little bit of the fabric of the hat. Now, we don't want to see it on the outside. So when I pull, when I go through the fabric, I shouldn't see my needle out here. And then you're going to go across the fold here. And then onto the hat, but try to go between the fibers so that it doesn't really show here. Okay, so then it should kind of disappear as you're stitching, and you shouldn't see any orange on this side. or black. I'm gonna use black, but. Okay, so for the beret, what I want to do is take the bottom part of the beret and the top part of the beret. And I want to put the right sides together. So I'm gonna put the side without markings faced up. And I'm gonna try to find my center back, which is over here. And line those markings first. And my chalk mark starts to disappear the more you touch the fabric. It kind of rubs off. So I just want to check it as I go. Okay, I'm gonna pin here. Make sure my lines match. And I basically want to pin at the 1/2 inch mark so that I know I'm gonna stitch right there. Okay, so I'm gonna start it from my center back, and then I'll do the side seams and make sure they match, and they do not. So match those up. Center front. And the other side. And a beret is gonna be much easier to sew together than the 8-piece hat, because we just have to stitch once all the way around here, and then we have to stitch the headband, side band here, and then we'll do the same kind of finishing that the 8-piece hat had with that side band. Okay, so now to stitch around the outside. Okay, the outside edge is stitched, and now I have to do what's called grading. And what grading is, or grading a seam, is you trim one side down of the seam allowance halfway, so half as long. And that'll help when these are flipped right side out, it won't be as bulky. So I'm just gonna do that now. And once that's done, what we have to do next is we need to notch this outer circle. So this seam allowance needs notches cut out, which are these triangles that you remove from the seam allowance. Okay. And that allows it, when it's flipped right side out, for this seam allowance to compress and it doesn't get too bulky. So about every 1/2 inch, you're gonna do a new notch. And you don't wanna try not to clip this stitching line, otherwise you'll have holes in your hat. Now the next step is to take the side band and to match up the edges and stitch across the 2 lines, the center back lines. And then once that's stitched, I'm gonna pin it onto the hat, and I'm gonna match up my center back with that line. I'm gonna do the same thing I did for the 8-piece hat. I'm gonna quarter this onto the beret, matching up my markings first, and then quartering them. And then once that's quartered, I'm going to come back to my machine and I'm going to stitch this around in a circle. And then now I'm going to do the same thing I did on the 8-piece hat. I'm gonna fold this edge at a 1/2 inch, press it, and fold it on the inside and stitch it. I know it's hard to see here, but I'm gonna do exactly the same thing. And actually, before we do that, I'm gonna flip it back right side up. We need to clip this line because this seam allowance is pulling. And what we want to do is give it little slashes. And try not to cut your stitching line. And this will just ease some of the tension that is on the seam allowance. The last step is to take this side band and pin it to the rest of the beret, and then we're going to stitch this line just like we did with the other hat. And I'm tucking all this excess seam allowance inside and hiding it. And you could line this hat. You would make a copy of this bottom and the top and stitch them together, and then you would wedge it in between here right now and cover this part of the hat, so the inside would be finished and the outside would be your beret. Okay, so we have our 8-piece cap with the little button on top. It could be kind of like a 1920s newsboy or something like that. And then I have the beret, which is really simple, but I end up using this pattern so often because it could be used kind of like a peasant hat, a Renaissance cap. You can put a feather on it, so it's really versatile. And there you have it.